Hi everyone, welcome to our video tutorial on our offset 4-patch technique sheet. Now this is a technique sheet that we developed in collaboration with our Running with Scissors quilt team of certified instructors. It's designed to go along with our 4-patch square up tool. Now that tool was designed to do traditional 4-patches. And it wasn't in our hands very long before we realized, you know, it could also be used to do what we call an offset 4-patch. Instead of having 4 squares, it has a small square, a large square, and 2 rectangles. And so what we're going to do today is talk you through how you create those offset 4-patch units. So the first step in the process is to determine the size that you want to make. And I'm going to, for our video purposes, create a 3-inch finished unit. And when I look at the chart that's on the technique sheet, there are 17 sizes on there. To make sure that I'm staying on track, I always tend to highlight the size that I'm doing. I can either do that with a dry erase Expo marker, or I can use glow line tape and place glow line tape on there, and it helps to keep me on track and not making any mistakes. Now, I've decided for my offset 4-patch, I'm going to make a 3-inch unit with a small green square, a large red square, and then the rectangles are both going to be yellow. And when I consult the chart for my 3-inch size unit, it tells me that I need to cut 4 strips. 2 strips that are narrow, they're cut at 1 3/4 for the small square and one of the rectangles, and 2 strips that are 2 3/4 inches wide. 1 for the large square and 1 for the other rectangle. And once I have those cut, I'm going to mix and match them before I do my stitching. So I'm going to take the wide rectangle strip, team it up with the narrow small square strip, and then I'm going to take the small rectangle strip and team it up with the large square strip. And that's going to be my sewing order when I head to my sewing machine. So once you've done your stitching, and you want to do that at a good 1/4 inch, I headed right to my ironing board, and you're going to press your strip sets toward the square. On this one, the green is going to be my small square, so I press that strip set toward the green. On this one, the red is going to be my large square, and I press that strip set in that direction. Now, normally if you were doing a 4-patch, you'd be able to layer these up and start doing your subcutting, but you can't do that with the offset 4-patch. You're going to have to cut them separately, individually, because they're cut at different increments. Let's start with the large square strip set. When I go to subcut this, what I'm going to do is subcut this the same width as this large square strip. I cut that 2 3/4, and so what I need to do now is cut that using the 2 3/4 inch increment on a regular ruler. So first step is to clean up the edge, and there's a couple ways you can do that. A lot of times what I'll do is I will place one of the lines on my regular ruler on the seam, take another tool, place it right up against, kind of making a T-square, and use that rather than cutting the strip and turning the strip. Once I have the edge cleaned up, the next step is to use my 2 3/4 inch increments. So when I'm looking at this tool, again, always keep one of the lines on the seam to keep it perpendicular for my cutting, and I'm going to cut it the size of the square. And that, in this case, is 2 3/4. So I'm going over 1, 2 3/4 and making that cut. And I'll move along, doing the same thing, working down. And when it comes to the small square strip, what I'm going to be doing with that is, again, subcutting the same size as the small square strip. 1 3/4 was the size for my project. This end is already cleaned up, and I'm going to do the same scenario, put a crosshair on there, find my 1 3/4 inch along this line, and work my way down. If you have not done a lot of strip piecing, and you want to hear some of the hints and tips that I give to students when I'm teaching a class that has strip piecing, visit my tips and tricks video. I do those every Thursday, and I did one on successful strip piecing. Things that you can add to your working operation to give you better results. One of the things I do want to warn you as, if you're working through a long strip, don't make more than about a half a dozen cuts before you come back and make sure that it's really nice and square, because it's easy to get it skewed a little bit. So when I'm ready to sew, I take my piles and I set them up for assembly line piecing. If you can learn to do assembly line construction, it really does build efficiency into your quilting projects. And so what I'm going to do is take one of each, line them up so that they're right sides together, line them up so that the raw edge is even, and line them up so that the seams nest at that intersection. That's what's going to make that nice, crisp meat in those 4-patch units. And you know, if you've pressed correctly, that nest is easy. And I set myself up so I generally sew with the small square going under the needle first. And I do that stitching in a chain piecing fashion. Again, this is going to really streamline your construction by stitching one behind the next, behind the next. When I go to take these units to the ironing board for pressing, this is where I do a nice little spin trick that you may or may not know about. Rather than taking these and pressing them like this or pressing them like this, if you take a look at the back of the piece, there's a couple of stitches here and a couple of stitches right here that can be removed. And you can do that with a seam ripper or with just a little twist. And if you remove those stitches, those north-south stitches across that last line, you can make a nice little spin in that project, making for a very nice flat center, and you'll see that you've got a perfect match. To see more information on that spinning technique, visit my Thursday tips and tricks again. So we've finally come to the 4-patch square up. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Studio 180 Design's philosophy, realize that everything we make in our units is slightly oversized, so that if they're not perfect when we're done with our stitching, we can trim them down to the correct size. Which size do you use? Well, that information is in the chart. So I usually start by trimming down the small square. And when I consulted the chart, it told me what I needed to use was the bullseye for a 2-inch unit there. And I'm going to take that bullseye for the 2-inch, place it over top of the seam intersections so that I have lines lining up north and south, lines going east and west, and the bullseye up for the 2 right in the center, and give that corner a cleanup. Now that's how I would do that if I was right-handed. If you happen to be left-handed, instead of having that square in the upper right-hand corner, you would simply position that square in the upper left-hand corner, lining up the same lines and crosshairs so that you can trim easily left-handed. But after I've trimmed the small square, you pick up the unit, rotate that 180 degrees, and now I've got the large square in the upper right-hand corner, and the bullseye that I need to locate is the 4-inch. And so that crosshair bullseye for the 4 is going to go at the seam crosshairs. What will also happen is a cleanup line of 3.5 inches will line up with those edges that I previously trimmed, so that I know I'm creating a unit that when it goes into a project is going to finish to 3 inches. You don't have very much waste, but you have a perfect unit when you're all done. So there you have it. That's your offset 4-patch. You can use them by themselves. You can use them in conjunction with some of our other units, and you can really add some extra zest to projects that have a traditional 4-patch. Give them a totally different look by using the offset 4-patch. So don't forget, check for this at your local quilt shop first. And you'll also need the 4-patch square up tool. If they don't have them, you can come directly to us and we'll get them into your hands as soon as possible.